Welcome to Maine at 200. You're about to watch a decade-by-decade account of some of the more remarkable things that have happened in the state of Maine during the last 2 centuries, just in time for the state to celebrate its 200th birthday. I'm Phil Blampied, producer of Maine at 200. Did you know that Maine almost didn't become a state because the majority of its congressional delegation voted against it? Did you know that in the early years of the state, when the border between the United States and Canada was still badly defined and the British and the Americans were having conflicts over it, that one of the only military victories the Americans won in northern Maine came about because a bear joined them in attacking the enemy? Did you know the first woman to serve in both houses of the U.S. Congress came from Maine? These are only a few examples of the remarkable things that have happened in Maine in the last 200 years. It starts with the founding of the state on March 15, 1820, and continues up until the present day. There are few ways better to celebrate the bicentennial of Maine than to take some time to hear about the details of its colorful history.
Yesterday, Maine became a state. The day was noticed, as far as we have heard from the various towns, by every demonstration of joy and heartfelt congratulation as becoming the occasion. That was a report in the Eastern Argus, a newspaper in Portland, Maine. Maine was originally part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and at first most Mainers liked it that way. Residents voted no fewer than 6 times between 1792 and 1819 on whether to leave Massachusetts. Statehood failed on the first 5 votes. Behind the new majority in favor of statehood was a growing population, restless for more local control. Things happened quickly after the 1819 vote, with a convention held at Portland's first Parish church meeting hall in October to write a constitution for the state, and another popular vote in December with 92% of the voters approving that new constitution. Southern members of Congress were unwilling to let northern states, where slavery was outlawed, to get a majority of the members of Congress. A complex deal, now known as the Missouri Compromise, was orchestrated by Speaker of the House Henry Clay to trade the admission of Missouri as a slave state in order to balance the votes of Maine coming in as a free state. Because the deal expanded slave territory into Missouri, many in Maine were opposed to it, even though their statehood depended on it. When the final vote was cast, 5 out of the 7 congressmen from Maine, still a Massachusetts district, actually voted against the Missouri Compromise, which squeaked by with a majority of only 3 votes. In 1821, the town of Canton was founded. In 1823, the town of Skowhegan was incorporated using the name Millburn. In 1826, a cotton mill was founded on Factory Island in the Saco River in Saco. The mill was eventually called York Manufacturing, and it remained open until 1958. In 1827, Waldo County was founded, and Augusta was named the state capital. By 1830, the population of Maine was 399,455, showing an increase of more than a third during the first 10 years since the founding of the state. In 1832, the state capital was finally moved to Augusta 5 years after the legislature first voted to move it from Portland. In 1833, Melville Fuller, who became the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1888, was born in Augusta. In 1835, a lumber boom around Bangor made it the biggest lumber port in the world. Logs were floated down the Penobscot River from the thick woods north of the city, processed at sawmills in the city, then shipped down the river to the Atlantic and then to ports around the world. That year, Milton Bradley, founder of the toy company, was born in Vienna. In 1838, Franklin and Piscataquis counties were founded. Here's the story.
In the early 19th century, the border between the United States and Canada wasn't very clearly drawn. And by the 1820s, there was a lot of conflict in northern Maine where it borders New Brunswick. And American loggers wanted to take trees in areas that Canadians thought were theirs, and Canadian loggers wanted to take trees in areas that the Americans thought were theirs. As a result, there were a lot of confrontations, and many new American settlers moved into the area who took advantage of these confrontations to try to create a movement to separate that territory from the St. Johns River in New Brunswick over to what is now Aroostook County. And the state of Maine finally sent some agents to the area to investigate what was going on, to see what the population was up there and what their sentiments were. And the Canadian authorities attempted to arrest these agents. This drew the attention of the federal government, the U.S. government, and it started to become a more serious matter. And things had gotten so out of hand that by 1838, both the Maine legislature and the U.S. Congress appropriated funds to send troops to the border to defend, supposedly, the Americans and their claims in Madawaska against the Canadians. No record of any fatalities or any shots being fired. But that all almost changed in the last few days of 1838. According to one record, on December 29th, 1838, some New Brunswick lumberjacks were spotted felling trees on what was considered to be American land. 2 days later, New Year's Eve, the New Brunswick woodcutters came back and they were ordered to leave by the Americans who were now patrolling the area. The Canadians refused to leave. And so both sides pulled their firearms out, and it looked like a battle was about to begin. But just as this was about to start, a bear came out of the woods and started harassing the Canadians. The Canadians had to start defending themselves against the bear. 2 of the Canadians were actually injured by the bear. They finally killed the bear, facing both having the Americans having their firearms out and having been attacked by a bear. The Canadians withdrew. So this was, thanks to the bear, considered an American victory of sorts. So the U.S. government stepped in and sent U.S. General Winfield Scott, who was later become famous for his role in the Mexican-American War. And he came to the area and managed to negotiate a truce. And so the Aroostook War came to a relatively peaceful end in March of 1839.
In 1839, following a truce in the Aroostook War, Aroostook County was founded. In 1842, the Aroostook War was finally settled as U.S. Secretary of State Daniel Webster and British Lord Ashburton signed the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, an agreement that resolved border questions between the United States and Canada from Maine to the Great Lake. Also in 1842, an anti-abolitionist riot broke out at the First Parish Church in Portland. The church had been the center of anti-slavery activities, including hosting a speech at one point by abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. In 1845, Poland spring water came onto the market for the first time. Mark Dubois, natural resource manager for Poland Spring today, tells the story.
So by 1845, they were bottling the water in clay demijohns, and the family started to make first commercial sales of water out of the Port of Portland and selling water in Portland.
In 1848, the world was at last able to buy chewing gum, thanks to John B. Curtis of Bangor, who developed a gum made out of spruce sap and sold it as pure spruce gum. It was the first commercially available chewing gum. In 1849, the effects of the gold rush in California began to be felt in Maine. There was a great increase in the demand for Maine lumber, particularly that shipped out of the big lumber port in Bangor. Also in 1850, the Bates Manufacturing Company founded its textile mill in Lewiston to use the water power from the Androscoggin River. The Bates Manufacturing Company thrived during the Civil War, and then Bates supplied uniforms to the Union Army. And in 1850, Pepperell Company established mills on the Saco River in Biddeford. In 1851, spurred by prohibitionists like Portland's Neil Dow, Maine became the first state in the nation to try to ban the manufacture and sale of alcohol. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published the influential book Uncle Tom's Cabin. In 1853, the completion of the section of the Grand Trunk Railway from Quebec to Maine made Portland the primary ice-free seaport for Canadian exports in the winter, spurring an era of prosperity in Portland that lasted for decades. In 1854, Androscoggin and Sagadahoc counties were formed. In Westbrook, the S.D. Warren Paper Company was launched, a company still active today as Sappi Limited. The Warren Mill was the first to mix wood fibers and rag fibers in the paper-making process and became the largest in the world. Also in 1854, there was an upsurge of violence against Roman Catholics in several parts of Maine, with the Roman Catholic Church in Bath burned to the ground by a mob. Here's the story.
The decade of the 1850s in Maine saw an unprecedented explosion of violence against Roman Catholics and the Roman Catholic Church. This was the result of factors that were evident across the nation at that time. There had been a tremendous wave of immigration of Catholic immigrants from Germany, especially from Ireland after the potato famine in Ireland. And these new immigrants were competing with the old Yankee Protestant workers for jobs, causing some resentments by people who opposed them. The Know-Nothings were quite successful. They actually managed to win a majority of the seats in the Massachusetts legislature in the mid-1850s, and they helped foment resentment against Catholics and all immigrants. In Bath in 1854, a Catholic church was burned to the ground. A Jesuit priest, Johannes Baptist, was tarred and feathered in Ellsworth, and things were so tense that when the vicar of Baltimore was offered the position of the Bishop of Portland, he refused the job because he thought it was too dangerous. Things finally calmed down. The American Party faded away because, oddly enough, half of its members were against slavery, and they eventually were absorbed by the Republican Party. And then a lot of the violent energies that existed in the society at the time were subsumed by the Civil War, as all the young men went off to war, and a lot of the energy that was on the street now was on the battlefield.
In 1855, Bates College was founded, initially called the Maine State Seminary. It was the first coeducational university in New England and the first to admit African Americans. In 1857, the Cabot Manufacturing Company was established in Brunswick to make cotton textile. In 1859, Frank O. Farrington of Brewer patented a machine for edging and turning bricks, and Brewer became a regional center for brickmaking with over a dozen brickyards, eventually turning out 12 million bricks annually. It is said that most of the famous Back Bay and South End neighborhoods of Boston, with their stately row houses and townhouses, are built of Brewer brick. In 1861, riots broke out in Lewiston. They were called the Cotton Riots, since many of the rioters were workers from the Bates Mill who were provoked by a rumor that Benjamin Bates, the mill owner, had accumulated a vast fortune. Also in 1861, the Civil War broke out, and Maine was heavily involved. In 1862, the U.S. Army built Camp Keyes in Augusta. In World War I, it served as a mobilization center for troops, and it's still in use by the National Guard today. The Farmington Normal School, now the University of Maine at Farmington, began operating as the first public college in Maine on August 24th. In 1865, the University of Maine was founded as a land-grant and sea college. In 1866, the city of Portland, Maine suffered a catastrophic fire. The Great Fire of Portland, Maine, which occurred on July 4, 1866, ignited during the Independence Day celebrations and destroyed most of the commercial buildings of the city, half the churches, and hundreds of homes. The fire started in a boathouse on Commercial Street, perhaps caused by a firecracker or a cigar ash. The fire spread to a lumberyard and then to a sugar house, then across the city, eventually burning out on Munjoy Hill in the city's East End. In 1867, British-born Thomas Goodall established the Goodall Mills in Sanford. His factory, located on the Mousom River, first manufactured carriage robes and blankets. Later it would expand to many other products, including mohair for upholstering railroad seats, carpets, draperies, auto fabrics, military uniform fabrics, and fabric for summer suits. In 1869, Ellsworth incorporated as a city. In 1870, the population of Maine was 626,915. Also in 1870, the state of Maine made an unprecedented decision to recruit immigrants to settle some of the undeveloped northern lands by sending a representative to Sweden offering free land to would-be settlers. Glenn Parkinson is a board member of the Ski Museum of Maine, the International Skiing History Association, and the U.S. National Ski Hall of Fame, as well as the author of the Maine ski history book, First Tracks. He tells the story.
In the mid-1800s, the northern part of Maine was covered in woods, and it was essentially wilderness. There was very little civilization once you got north of Bangor. So May of that year, 1870, Woodrow Thomas sailed to Sweden, and he recruited Swedes. July 23rd, 1870, Woodrow Thomas arrived back in what is now the town of New Sweden with 22 men, 11 women, and 18 children. They were given land and a home, and that winter, 1870-71, 150 years ago, that was the first time that anyone skied in the state of Maine. Those Swedes did what they knew. They knew skiing, so they brought skis over with them.
In 1873, Oakland was incorporated as the town of West Waterville. The name was changed to Oakland in 1883. Also in 1873, earmuffs for the purpose of thermal protection were invented by Chester Greenwood of Farmington, Maine. He later founded a factory in his hometown of Farmington to produce earmuffs and other products. In its best year, 1936, the earmuff factory produced over 400,000 pairs. In 1977, the state of Maine declared December 21st to be Chester Greenwood Day. Also in 1874, Maine Medical Center in Portland opened for the first time as Maine General Hospital. Architect Francis Fassett designed the new hospital to include 4 pavilions around a central administration building. In 1875, the Maine legislature for the first time made education compulsory for all children between the ages of 9 and 15, requiring that they attend school at least 3 months a year. In April 1878, the first commercial telephone system opened in Maine when phones were installed at the offices of Randall and McAllister, a coal company, at 84 Commercial Street in Portland. Telephone service was introduced in Augusta, the state capital, for the first time. The telephone book followed soon after in 1881. The National Bell Telephone Company published a directory with 7 pages listing 425 subscribers. In 1882, the Portland Society of Art, later the Portland Museum, was founded. In 1883, the town of Old Orchard Beach was incorporated. In 1884, Augusta resident, Maine U.S. Senator, and former Secretary of State James Blaine ran for president as a Republican but lost narrowly to Grover Cleveland, the Democrat. Earlier, when he was a member of the state legislature, Blaine had purchased and lived in a house in Augusta. His family later donated it to the state, and it's now the governor's official residence, named the Blaine House. Blaine served twice as Secretary of State and unsuccessfully sought the Republican nomination for president in 1876 and 1880, before finally being nominated in 1884. Also in 1884, Bath Iron Works was founded. In 1887, Charles Foster established the first wooden toothpick factory in the United States in Strong, Maine. He used white birch from the surrounding woods for his picks. His enterprise made Strong the self-described toothpick capital of the world, with production levels eventually peaking in the 20th century with an estimated 75 billion toothpicks a year. Also in 1887, capital punishment was abolished in Maine. In 1889, the city of Lewiston saw its first hospital, established by the Sisters of Charity of Montreal, who opened the Asylum of Our Lady of Lourdes. In 1890, the population of Maine had grown to 661,086. In 1891, Old Town incorporated as a city. In 1892, poet and author Edna St. Vincent Millay was born in Rockland. In 1894, famous movie director John Ford was born in Cape Elizabeth. In 1897, the brothers Francis and Freeland Stanley of Kingfield produced their first Stanley Steamer automobile, run by the power of hot water and sold from 1902 to 1924. In 1898, the sinking of a battleship named after the state of Maine in Havana Harbor in Cuba sparked the Spanish-American War, in which hundreds of Maine soldiers and sailors were to serve. Also in 1898, the Old Orchard Beach Pier was built. The pier had a ballroom at its end and hosted such acts as Guy Lombardo, Louis Armstrong, Benny Goodman, Xavier Cugat, and Frank Sinatra. And in that year, the first canoe built by the Old Town Canoe Company was constructed behind the Gray Hardware Store in Old Town, Maine. In 1901, the Oxford Paper Company was established in Rumford by Hugh Chisholm. It used the power of the Rumford Falls on the Androscoggin River to manufacture paper. The company was the sole manufacturer of the U.S. Post Office postcards, as well as the country's largest book paper manufacturer. In 1905, construction of the cathedral in Lewiston, known as the Church of Saints Peter and Paul, began and wasn't finished until 1938. It's the largest Roman Catholic church in Maine and Lewiston's most prominent landmark. On July 8, 1908, Nelson Rockefeller, later to become governor of New York State and vice president of the United States, was born on his family's estate in Bar Harbor. In 1909, the largest wooden ship ever built was launched in Bath. The ship was called Wyoming, and it was a wooden 6-masted schooner built and completed by the firm of Percy and Small. With a length of 450 feet, Wyoming was the largest known wooden ship ever built. In In 1910, the population of Maine had risen to 742,371. In 1911, Bangor suffered a catastrophic fire, now known as the Great Fire of 1911. The city lost its high school, its post office, its customs house, the public library, telephone and telegraph companies, banks, 2 fire stations, nearly 100 businesses, 6 churches, a synagogue, and 285 private residences. In 1912, the first hospital in Presque Isle was established. Also in that year, Leon L. Bean opened a store in the basement of his brother's apparel shop at Freeport Corner, selling the Bean Boot, or Maine hunting shoe. In 1916, Acadia National Park on Mount Desert Island was founded on July 8th as Sieur de Monts National Monument. It was not until January 1929 that it was officially named Acadia National Park. In 1917, on April 1st, President Woodrow Wilson declared war on Germany. Maine's National Guard was called up immediately and preparations were made for fortifying the coast. 1918, many of the deaths among members of the service weren't from combat injuries, but from the effects of the epidemic of Spanish influenza, which killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people around the world. Maine residents coming to visit friends or relatives in the camp brought the flu back to Maine with them. By late September, the flu was appearing throughout southern and central Maine. Before it was over, nearly 1% of Maine's population had died, more than 5,000 people. Since there was no effective treatment for the virus, Maine communities struggled to cope with the epidemic, attempting to ban large public gatherings and taking measures such as Portland's plan to strictly enforce the law against spitting in public. Among the more controversial efforts were attempts to ban church services. In response, in some communities, Catholic masses were held outdoors. The state also increased the power of state and local health authorities to deal with epidemics. Maine was one of the first states in the country to require physicians to report influenza cases and to give local boards of health the power to enforce quarantines. One outcome of the epidemic was the founding of Mercy Hospital in Portland. In 1922, Dora Pinkham, a Republican from Fort Kent, became the first woman to serve in the Maine legislature thanks to the amendment to the U.S. Constitution giving women the right to vote 2 years earlier. And in 1923, keeping the prize in Maine hands, the Pulitzer Poetry Award went to Maine native Edna St. Vincent Millay. In 1925, the first commercial radio station in Maine, WCSH, began broadcasting in Portland. In 1928, Westbrook resident and musician Rudy Valley began his radio career in which his distinctive crooning style of singing made him the first of the modern teen idols. In 1931, Governor Percival Baxter began donations of land around Mount Katahdin that would eventually become Baxter State Park. In 1935, spurred on by President Franklin Roosevelt, the federal government launched a project in Eastport to harness the energy of the ocean tides flowing through Passamaquoddy Bay. Called the Passamaquoddy Tidal Project, it drew hundreds of workers to the area and went through about $7 million in funds in its first several months. Also in 1935, the business of downhill skiing in Maine got its start as townspeople in Fryeburg organized a commercial rope tow on the town's Jockey Cap ski run, not only setting up the ski run, but also organizing an excursion train from Portland.
That day there were 300 people skiing on Jockey Cap, and there were 3,000 people that had come from Portland and surrounding communities to watch the skiers. It was a banner day for the town, and the town of Fryeburg continued that tradition. They ran snow trains for the rest of the winter and the next couple years.
In 1937, one of the largest labor conflicts in Maine's history took place in Lewiston and Auburn as employees of the shoe manufacturers in the two cities went on strike. Thousands of workers walked off the job at the 19 shoe companies in the two cities on March 25, 1937. The strike came to a dramatic climax on April 21st as workers tried to march across the South Bridge on the Androscoggin River. Governor Lewis Barrows called in the National Guard. Since the federal government had recently enacted laws guaranteeing the right of workers to vote for and have a union, an election supervised by the U.S. Department of Labor took place on May 15th, with the overwhelming majority of the workers voting to join the United Shoe Workers of America. In 1938, the first full-scale commercial ski area in Maine opened at Pleasant Mountain in Bridgeton and remains in operation today as Shawnee Peak.
Then the CCC arrived in the mid-30s, and the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, was designed to create jobs and to do land improvements, amongst other things. On Pleasant Mountain, they created the first ski trails from the top of the mountain.
In 1940, the population of Maine had reached 847,226. Also in that year, Margaret Chase Smith was elected to Congress for the first time. A Skowhegan resident, she ran after her husband Clyde Smith, who was the congressman from the area, suffered a heart attack and died. After serving 4 terms, she ran for the Senate in 1949 and won, becoming the first woman to serve in both houses of Congress. She achieved national recognition when she defied the strong anti-communist opinion of the day by criticizing Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist witch hunt in her 1950 speech, Declaration of Conscience. In 1941, the Maine legislature authorized the creation of the Maine Maritime Academy at Castine for training merchant sea officers. And of course, in December 1941, World War II was declared. Maine eventually sent about 80,000 of its residents to serve in the armed forces. 2,556 were killed. Maine felt the effects of the war, too, by the establishment of several prisoner of war camps in Aroostook County. With the labor shortages growing out of the war, the military allowed some Aroostook County farmers to use German prisoners to work in their fields. In 1943, the last log drive took place on the Saco River. In December 1947, the first section of the Maine Turnpike opened, running from Kittery to Portland. When the authority cut the ribbon on the new road, the Maine Turnpike was the first superhighway built in the post-war era and one of only 2 modern toll roads in existence in the United States at that time. In 1948, Andrew Wyeth painted the iconic Christina's World, a portrait of Christina Olson of Cushing, Maine. The Korean War started in June of 1950. Nearly 30,000 Mainers served in the conflict, and there were 242 fatalities. In 1953, the first commercial television station in Maine, WABI in Bangor, went on the air January 25th. In 1954, Edmund Muskie was elected governor, the first Democrat to be elected in 20 years. Another result of the November 1954 elections was that Native Americans in Maine finally got full voting rights when a statewide referendum was approved by a 3-to-1 margin. Tribal representatives in the state legislature remained observers only. Also in 1954, Burlington Mills, then the nation's largest textile firm, bought the former Goodall Mill in Sanford. But Burlington just disassembled the Sanford factory and moved the looms there to factories in the South. Burlington closed the Sanford Mill, leaving 3,600 unemployed and 2 million square feet of empty mill space. On September 25th, the first direct cable phone call from the United States to Europe was made. All such calls at that time were routed through Portland's Forest Avenue Telephone Exchange building. In 1961, a futuristic-looking dome suddenly appeared in the woods in Andover, Maine. It was the Andover Earth Station, and it was built to send and receive signals from the first American telecommunications satellite, Telstar. The local school district wound up choosing the name Telstar for its new high school being built in Bethel. In 1964, the escalation of the Vietnam War began. Nearly 50,000 Mainers were in some branch of the service during the Vietnam era, not all sent to Vietnam, but among Mainers serving in Vietnam there were 341 recorded fatalities. In 1967, Caribou was incorporated as a city. Also in 1967, the state of Maine participated in a year-long effort to try to become the host site of the 1976 Winter Olympics. Encouraged by private investors who planned to develop a ski resort on Bigelow Mountain near Stratton and Rangeley, the state went so far as to win the endorsement of the New England Governors Conference for their bid. In 1971, the Maine Mall in South Portland opened. A former pig farm was chosen as a site for the project because it was close to I-95 and convenient from Portland. The construction of the Maine Mall marked a major transition in the western part of South Portland. In 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, sponsored by Maine Senator Edmund Muskie. The passage of the Clean Water Act marked a successful end to 1972 for Edmund Muskie, but it hadn't started out so successfully. 1972 was the year when he tried and failed to win the Democratic nomination for president. In 1975, James Bernard Longley Sr. was elected governor as an independent, the first independent in the state's history. The owner of a successful insurance agency in Lewiston, Longley had been appointed by the prior governor, Democratic Governor Kenneth Curtis, to a state commission intended to make government more efficient. Longley made several recommendations that saved the state millions of dollars, and he became well enough known as a result that he decided to run for governor when Curtis retired in 1974. In 1977, the historic redevelopment of the Old Port in Portland was spurred when, responding to a real estate investment consortium called the Old Port Association, the city of Portland issued bonds to build the Cumberland County Civic Center on the edge of the district. With tax incentives and federal grants, developers took the old buildings, apartments, and warehouses and turned them into a revitalized, historic-looking commercial and tourist area, which has become one of Portland's foremost attractions. The old Orchard Beach Pier was rebuilt after being destroyed by the blizzard of 1978. The current structure stretches 500 feet out into the Atlantic Ocean. Also in 1980, the U.S. Congress settled the claims that Native American tribes in Maine had placed on millions of acres of property by paying a settlement of $81.5 million to the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, and Maliseet tribes. In exchange for the settlement, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, and Maliseet tribes relinquished all further claims to land in Maine other than their existing tribal lands. In 1983, the last crank telephone system in the United States ended when the Bryan Pond Phone Company in Bryan Pond closed. The Bryan Pond Phone Company still had over 400 customers with crank phones when the system was finally converted over to a standard landline system. A statue of a giant phone was erected in Bryan Pond in commemoration. In 1985, Dr. Bernard Lown, who spent his teenage years in Auburn after immigrating from Lithuania with his parents, shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Russian Dr. Evgeny Shazov of the Soviet Union. A bridge connecting Lewiston and Auburn over the Androscoggin River has been dedicated to him as the Bernard Lown Peace Bridge. In 1986, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a guided missile frigate, was commissioned at Bath Iron Works. The ship was damaged 2 years later by an Iranian mine, leading to a several-day battle in 1988 between U.S. and Iranian naval forces in the Persian Gulf. Also in 1986, a bitter 76-day strike at the paper mill in Rumford, followed the next year by an 18-month strike at the paper mill in Jay, precipitated the decline of organized labor in the paper industry. The loss of the strike not only weakened unions, it also signaled the end of an era in many Maine communities where being able to get a well-paid job at the local mill was almost guaranteed. In 1987, a sudden thaw of a deep snowpack in the spring caused catastrophic flooding among many of Maine's rivers, including the Kennebec and the Androscoggin. Former Androscoggin County Emergency Management Agency Director Joanne Potvin describes how it was in Lewiston and Auburn.
It caused extensive damage, nearly $1 million in Androscoggin County alone. You can't stop the mighty Androscoggin River, so it does what it wants to do. And what we can do is, help prepare the municipalities that are going to be affected by the river, hoping that people heed our advice when we give them the advice that they have to relocate or evacuate, move to higher ground. So the river has a mind of its own, and it's going to do what it wants to do.
Voters approved term limits for legislators and some state officers by a 2-to-1 margin. The question had been placed before the voters by a citizens' referendum. 1998 was marked by the ice storm, which began on January 4th. The massive regional ice storm hit parts of the Northeast and Canada. Central Maine was particularly hard hit. The storm resulted in millions of dollars worth of damage. By daybreak on January 9th, Central Maine Power reported that 275,000 customers, representing about 600,000 people, had lost electricity. Most city dwellers got their power back within a few days, but residents of some rural areas waited for weeks. In 1999, Bethel, Maine was the home of the world's tallest snowman. Called Angus in honor of the incumbent governor, it was 10 stories tall. The mouth was made out of car tires, the buttons were skidder tires, the arms were 25-foot spruce trees, and the hat was a 16-foot fabric construction made by middle school students. Newry resident and civil engineer Jim Sisko was in charge of the project. The town of Bethel topped Angus in 2008 by building a bigger snow sculpture yet, a snow woman named Olympia in honor of the incumbent senator. In 2001, after a century and a half in business, the Bates Mill in Lewiston closed, symptomatic of the flight of textile manufacturing to areas with lower labor and other costs. In 2001, Maine played a tragic role in the September 11th attacks, as 2 of the terrorists stayed in South Portland the night before their attack on the World Trade Center and flew to Boston from Portland Airport. In December 2001, passenger railroad service returned to Maine for the first time since the 1960s, when the Downeaster Amtrak train began operations between Portland and Boston on December 15th. In 2002, Richard Russo, a resident of Camden, won the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Fiction by an American Author for Empire Falls, a book about a declining mill town in Maine. In 2003, the last wooden clothespin and toothpick factory in the United States closed down as Foster's in Strong shut its doors. Also that year, the road to casino gambling in Maine was opened as voters narrowly approved an initiated question on the November ballot supposedly to allow slot machines at racetracks or within a 5-mile radius of racetracks. In 2010, the population of Maine was 1,328,361. In 2012, in November, the first independent to win a Senate seat in Maine was elected, as Angus King won the seat with slightly more than 51% of the vote. Also in 2012, voters approved a referendum question that had been put on the ballot by citizens' petition allowing same-sex marriage. In 2016, marijuana use became legal. Also in that election, Maine voters approved ranked choice voting for statewide elections for governor, state legislature, and Congress. In 2017, on June 23rd, a massive fire in a century-old abandoned mill building in Sanford brought more than 100 firefighters from 20 communities to fight the blaze. In 2018, Janet Mills became the first woman to be elected to the governorship in the state of Maine. Mills had previously been Attorney General, where she had also been the first woman to hold the position.